Good afternoon. We realized that we drew the lunch hour slot, so we're particularly excited to have a good crowd and to discuss this topic. I will introduce myself quickly. I'm David Jagan. I'm a partner with F Prime Capital, a venture capital firm, and an investor in Oxoni. We invested a couple of years ago, followed by Andreessen Horowitz, and then a really strong group of strategic investors, including JP Morgan, Goldman, Next, Citi. And I think personally that you're at the best panel in the conference. And I say that because this has to be the most real and material deployment that is underway. It's not a pilot. You have all of the right players at the table here. And I think you're going to find when something as magnificent, or with the magnitude of $11 trillion worth of bilateral credit derivatives is moving to a new platform, that's material and real. So I'm going to start by asking the speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll come back, describe the agenda, and get going.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Todd McDonald from R3, one of the co-founders and head of ecosystem development.
Good morning. Pramod Achanta from IBM. I lead our blockchain consulting practice.
Rob Palatnik, Chief Technology Architect for DTCC, and I already ate lunch, so I'm good.
That's not fair.
I'm Greg Chevet, the co-founder and chief executive officer of Axoni.
Great. So we're going to cover on this topic the what, the why, and the how, and probably what's next. And you invite questions as well. If we have a hand and I see it, we'll call on questions as we go, or attendees as we go. But I thought I would start, Robert, with you. I think the place to start here is really the existing landscape and describing for the crowd. When you have a panel with two acronyms in the title, it's worth describing what the existing platform looks like, what it does, and why it's so important to credit derivatives today.
Well, first, we started out with two acronyms in the title, and we realized that the only way to do a project is to bring in companies that have acronyms in all of their titles. So, as you know, for startups, name yourself as an acronym. We started a project about 10 years ago to take credit default swaps, which were mostly written on tickets and stuck in desk drawers, and put them onto a central ledger for the industry. When you do a project like that and you create a central ledger for the industry, it means each member of the industry has a copy of their particular book on their particular ledger, and then they send their trades to us. So we built this about 10 years ago. We hold that ledger, and when we looked at our mainframe technology, which was underlying this implementation 10 years ago, and we looked at the cost of it and where that market had gone, we already had a project to replace our core ledger and reduce the cost of that for the industry. In working with the industry and looking at this technology, we saw it was ideal. We bring a network, we bring a ledger-based workflow that already exists. We perform basic central ledger functions. These trades don't clear through us. There's not like a central settlement. There's not a lot of disruption. And the business functionality around almost all aspects of this particular trading asset is very well defined, and the workflows are very well defined. So as an opportunity, it's very well defined, and we did an ROI and saw that we could lower the cost of implementation by a nominal amount. But then working with the industry, if every firm in that ecosystem could take out that equal number, 25%, say, then instead of just taking 25% out of DTCC's cost, you could take 25% out of the entire industry cost. Instead of maintaining a mainframe that is the central ledger that everyone reconciles to, we had a common ledger distributed across the industry, and we provided onboarding and governance but didn't need to maintain a mainframe for that system anymore. We could dramatically reduce industry costs and simplify processing. So we brought a network, we brought a big use case, a simple use case, we brought a business proposition, and when we started looking around the industry and doing an RFP, we found a number of different firms that all wore gray suits and ties, and we found a good match.
Great.
And actually, David, one thing I would add to that as well, that one other point to DTCC's credit is there's also a legal framework surrounding the data that lives on that mainframe today, meaning that the firms that are a part of the network that Rob's describing have already pre-agreed that if there's data living there, that it comes with a certain set of legal constructs of recognition of that data and the accountability of both of the firms to use that as their core record of the trade. So the legal framework can be directly reapplied even if we're changing the underlying data structure or technology supporting it.
We delegate our tie wearing to Greg in the partnership usually.
Excellent. So I'm going to press on that just one more, I think, and maybe Pramod, you could add to Robert's comments, but I think the audience should understand, just kind of bring to life the actual trade that we're talking about in derivatives and what some of those post-life cycle events are. So they understand more what has to be migrated to the blockchain in this process.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Customer first.
Yeah.
So a credit default swap, for those who do not understand, is really an insurance protection against a loan. So if I make a loan to Greg and he is paying me a stream, somebody may say, well, I don't know if Greg is going to be good for that money, so we may need to take out insurance against that. And this is done across the industry, across the globe, really, in commodities, oil tankers. They take out bets against the price of oil or something happening to the tankers going around the world. Countries that issue debt, there's a lot of credit default swaps against that. So credit default swap is a common risk management instrument. Certainly in the movie The Big Short, everyone saw the way the instruments could be misused, but they are used for risk management and risk hedging in a very common way as a financial instrument. So as a transaction, it is a very common transaction, and there's very high value, 11 trillion, as has been commented earlier. So putting those all in a central ledger where there's a gold copy, and as Greg noted, where the legal constructs in terms of recognizing those is very important. There are interesting features to this type of transaction that make it uniquely suited for a ledger that has contract capabilities. There's a payment stream, so every month there's supposed to be payments made against a particular credit default swap, and if you have many of these credit default swaps, those payments may net. They can be retraded. So if you have taken a piece of a credit default swap transaction, you can trade out of that position. And then there are credit events. There has to be commonality among the holders of a particular credit default swap in terms of what a credit event is and what it means. So from a business perspective, the unique aspects of credit default swaps make it particularly suited for life cycle management and agreed upon ledger management.
That's great. Very good summary. Hopefully brings us to life. Greg, a question on, as Exoni is building a lot of the core tech that in a sense will re-platform some of the mainframe infrastructure over to a distributed ledger. Could you just describe what will that new platform look like?
Sure. So I think the key thing to recognize is that the biggest fundamental shift between the world that we're in today and a world on distributed ledger tech is one where any system that you have today, be it the trade information warehouse currently or any of the systems that manage these or other aspects for the firms that are involved, is that it's always been application specific first with synchronization or connectivity as a secondary or even tertiary thought. What we're saying here is we're going to start with a protocol and an implementation of a software that lives on that core set of protocol and rules that organizes first around synchronization and then building the application into that actual infrastructure. So we have everything from the consensus and messaging structure all the way through the application that's actually getting deployed into there, and the ability to write up custom contracts, write up custom functionality, and deploy it in a way where you not only have synchronization of the data, we ultimately can have synchronization of all of the calculations and business processes surrounding it as well, such that every party involved in whether it's a transaction, an update, whatever it might be, is seeing not only the data match, but they also have provability that they're reaching the same interpreted state as the end party as well.
Great. So there's probably a question that should be asked about this project and maybe others, and Todd, you could comment on why this project, in a sense. I mean, there's so many places in capital markets you could start, pre-trade, post-trade, other asset classes. Why is this a good starting point?
So if you look at what is behind this project, it really is a microcosm for a project within market infrastructure, within financial markets, because as Rob mentioned before, there was a pain point, right? So there was high cost for incumbent technology. That was first. Second, if you really look under the hood here, it's really about data and lifecycle events. And there are settlement aspects to it, but a lot of that is into existing settlement systems and cash flow systems. So you can ring fence what you're trying to do. Third thing, there was a will to do it. And I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that this didn't happen in a few months. It took a while, and it really was a journey. There was about 8 or 10 banks, I think initially was around, that got together with DTCC leading the charge, which, trust me, is very difficult to do to keep all those people aligned. And they needed to first understand what the problem was. Secondly, understand how DLT could help it, and that's where Greg and Axoni came in and did the initial POC over many months. And that's when the industry really came together for the RFP process. So you need to start with people were very, very conscious of the costs of the existing system. They can see the benefits going forward. And I think 3, if you look at the phases of this and how it's being implemented, we can go live over the coming months and years with sort of ring fencing the risks to it. So we're not going live with high value cross-border payments right off the bat. It is about managing data across multiple firms with DTCC helping to coordinate. So I think that's the important part. And I think it's also could be an example for how we evolve as an industry, because everyone's trying to figure out how that's going to happen. You need to have governance. You need to have a legal framework, and you need to have the operational model, and that's what DTCC brings. And then you have to have the will of the industry to push the envelope a little bit, because where we're trying to get to, I think where the real cost saves come, is when we truly distribute this to the participants. That's when the fun starts.
Well, and just to add to that, credit derivatives also is a very structured, asset class compared to any of the other derivatives that we have today. So, in some ways, it's the right point to start with. As Todd said, once you have the system in place, there's nothing that stops us from adding more asset classes to the same solution.
There's a couple comments. One is that there were some savings while just within the ring fence, so to speak, but the real savings, and not to mention the fun, begins as you push it out. So, Robert, coming back to you too, in terms of how should we think about the ROI on this project? Of course, there was will, and there was will for willingness to try and probably get off an aging mainframe. But what is CapEx? What is OpEx? What really drives this from a financial perspective?
There's a lot of good questions there, and I'll start with, it started with a business case that already existed, okay, and that was probably the magic ingredient. And the interesting thing about this, certainly from in the particular swaps market, is that this is I'll say the entry-level swap or the foundation. If we build this foundation and the network of the industry could take advantage of this foundation, there are many other asset classes that could be added on top of this that have very similar patterns. So we're solving some of the really interesting thorny problems that exist in any first implementation of a technology. And maybe that's not the direct question, but it gets to why we made the investment. You're integrating it into enterprise reporting systems, into enterprise schedulers, into the enterprise fabric. We are building this in the cloud. Okay, and many distributed ledger projects are being implemented in the cloud. We recently came out with a cloud white paper, and it's not that the cloud exists. I think many firms know that the cloud exists, and I think many of the regulators around the world know the cloud exists. But I don't think anybody has really believed that the financial industry was going to do significant critical transaction processing in the cloud. So that's pushing an envelope from a regulatory and a management perspective, but that's also, to your CapEx and OpEx question, suddenly the math of creating nodes, creating multiple nodes distributed in multiple places for security, for resiliency, is not this huge uplift. Then we're building with our partners using agile sprints, using a very quick, here's the epic, here's the story here, the epic's involved, how do we get to a quick deliverable, turning it around. The nice thing is we have a very fixed starting point and a very fixed definition of what success looks like.
Right.
We know what the business is, it exists today, it is already a network effect. So being able to re-implement that with the technology has allowed us to get to quick success stories. The very end of the story, if nothing else changes and we just replace the mainframe inside of DTCC, we could lower our costs by somewhere in the area of 20+% for this particular asset. That's interesting, but that's not magic. Yep. Taking 20% out of the whole industry, that's where the magic starts. Then adding other asset classes and reducing and basically retiring your stacks inside of your firms, that's where the hockey stick occurs. Yeah. Your stacks inside of your firms, that's where the hockey stick occurs.
Yeah, great. Pramod, this may be a question for you as well as you think industry-wide. So, the transactions, and when does that get pushed out more broadly?
So the step one really is, as Rob said, replacing the existing system with the DLT solution, which will be primarily, the user for that would be DTCC to begin with, right? But as we get that phase one in place, we start to now federate the nodes out to different member banks. And expectation is that DTCC would be the network administrator going forward. But each member bank would get their own node. Granted, given that there are 2,500 odd credit derivative participants in the market, not all of them are going to be getting a node anytime soon. So there will always be the top 10-15% participants who would get their own nodes, and the rest of them would interact with the solution just the way they're interacting with it today. Right?
That strikes me as that is an exciting day, right? The moment there is a non-DTCC participant with a node and participating in those transactions, that's a big moment in this transaction line.
So you can think of it of having more of a peer-to-peer architecture and be able to push out to the edge and getting more participants on. But you still have the operating model and the governance that DTCC offers. And we all know, and especially if you look at a market like CDS and other asset classes, that is essential to have as the overlay to that more peer-to-peer network.
Yeah. Greg, a question on that tech platform. So in some ways, this sounds like a database, right? You've got a mainframe with server processing computing, but at the heart of this, we're talking about database technology, and now it's distributed. As you think about what is being built for DTCC versus the technology being pushed out to the banks, what does that mean for database standards or, in a sense, the emergence of new database vendors to the industry?
Yeah, so there's a couple components there, right? So as the participants, there's really two things I would note. One is around standards, and then two is around what are the other things that can ride on that, and where the operational efficiencies come from. So first, we have agreed as part of this project to submit AxeCore, our core platform, into the Hyperledger project. So that will be open source at least by the time that this goes live. So there's all sorts of opportunities for firms to build things around that on their own. The second is once you have this infrastructure in-house within your firm, and all the supporting enterprise infrastructure around it, the ability to connect into any network running on that same protocol, same messaging system, it becomes very, very easy, and the marginal lift is very low, right? I mean, from our perspective, we're doing other implementations publicly with Next, replatforming the largest FX network for between prime brokers. For an end user to take this in, and I'm not going to name a name. Somebody puts this infrastructure in. They want to connect to the DTCC network for credit derivatives. They want to connect to the Next network for FX. That's the same piece of infrastructure, right? And so you end up with a world where you have standardization of what the core messaging and protocol looks like. It's very dynamic, so you can run all sorts of different assets on it. And then the marginal benefit to marginal cost ratio starts going up incredibly fast as more and more things start replatforming onto this.
Yeah. So staying on the product for a moment, I mean, there's some open questions, I suppose, around how much, like smart contracts. We're essentially already dealing with an asset class that has event-driven decision-making, right? ISDA pushes out that a payment is needed, and DTCC helps implement. How much of the decisioning and the automated triggers are being built into these smart contracts?
Maybe I'll take that. So we are taking an approach of finding the right balance in terms of what business processes we would put on the chain as part of smart contracts versus what will stay off chain. Some of the functions that DTCC performs today for the whole industry, where they're essentially the custodian for those processes, there is probably no need to duplicate that computational requirement across all nodes. So we're taking the approach to see what is the right balance. So there will be certainly some critical functionality that's going to be on-chain as smart contracts, but in the initial go, there would be some other functionality that will stay off-chain.
There's a real, and I just want to give our perspective before Greg adds. The real interesting thing about this technology, which is a lot different than previous, and as you start implementing, you'll learn a lot of things and you get your head around the different pieces. You can start relatively simple because it's not like you have to build a schema into your core transaction database and you are stuck with that schema for the rest of your lives. Now we can start out with trades and a relatively light smart contract that kind of describes what the messaging looks like within the contract, but keep a lot of the specific validation and business logic because those rules already exist to promote comment. Already those have been formalized externally in a model. But as the technology evolves and as you get more comfortable with the smart contract language, you can move more and more of that onto the chain. So that's the real beauty of this technology is it gives you this evolutionary path. You're not locked in where once you implement it one way, you have to go through a complete database rewrite in order to upgrade. It really is almost trade by trade. And you could just keep getting more and more intelligent or you could keep building that intelligence as time progresses and as you gain confidence.
That was exactly what I was going to say.
You think it's one of the risks that DTCC wanted to accept in being a leader in the space and being the first to try and do something in anger and implement it, where we're all collectively trying to find that right balance because the most important thing is to get live and to get deployment and get the right key stakeholders to accept the technology in the cloud or on-prem, and then do it in a way that gives the industry the right path to how they're going to adopt this. So that's the main function for R3 in this project is we've spent the last almost 2 years trying to figure out where the industry needs to get to and how do we evolve from there. And we hear the word standards quite a bit. Standards in our view is going to be emergent. So this is the emerging standard when we start to implement the TIW workflow. That's where the standards are going to be built on top of. And so everyone up here takes that responsibility to heart to make sure we get it right.
Yeah. So where does that stand today in terms of some of those decisions? In a sense, it's a question of have you worked through the 80% hard questions of like what to bake into what to reserve in business logic outside of the smart contracts versus what to bake into that? Or are there still big decisions to be made before you can go live?
I would say, we are taking the approach where, we have the base technology architecture in place now, which is also reviewed by not just, these teams, but, the industry member banks and, their technology teams. But as we start to implement some of these concepts, we are looking at some of the pros and cons that come out of the results, and we're constantly, fine-tuning our approach. I would say, using the agile process, the architecture and some of these decisions would be constantly tested to ensure that they are in line with the overall program objectives. So, but at this point in time, we do have a path forward.
Maybe as somewhat of an open question, but on the same vein of like naughty decisions that have yet to be resolved, right? What would you offer as like well, the industry and this group will need to get through this in order to go live, and here are the ones the audience should be aware of.
I'll just give an example. When we talk about blockchain solutions in a truly distributed sense that transcend multiple firms, some of the aspects that we need to still work out are like change management and governance aspects, right? So that's something that still we are in the process of discussing to understand what is the right model that we can apply. So things of that nature, which as we get closer to the game time, when the system goes live, and I'm sure some of these things would be more fully baked.
I would add to that also. What is the necessary components of infrastructure that needs to be mutualized, and what are the pieces that you can leave up to the individual market participants, infrastructure providers, service providers to build or deploy on their own, right? And so you have to sort of find what are the requirements of commonality, and what are the things maybe that can be offered or standardized around that but might not be necessary, or what are the things that are completely within the control of the end user without having an effect on the network health, safety, standardization, et cetera.
I think it's probably, I'd ask my panelists to sit back and relax. So I can see it, right? I just couldn't hold that tense posture.
Very awkward chairs.
These chairs are.
We were all like
I think I had these in my rec
And
room
in their
growing up.
lives, how decisions are made. Very, very collaboratively.
You know,
We follow the client.
I think that 80% keeps moving because I think, you know, with any new technology, and I think it was actually very well described in the opening page of the brochure for this conference that we're in the Pong era of Atari, and you know, but you know, there's lots of different versions of Pong out there, and figuring out how to harmonize them, and it's decentralized Pong, and when you have decentralized Pong with a central governance or function, what that model looks like is really still in evolution. So that 80% just keeps moving, and we keep solving thorny problems and really being able to make a big advance and then looking at the next. So, you know, in that evolution, we're starting internally, and then we're going to let firms take down nodes. And as you say, that's a big statement. It's a really big statement because now you have models that not only integrate with DTCC's enterprise systems, at the point that node comes down to a firm, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, it is integrating with that firm's identity systems and integrating with that firm's scheduler reporting systems, all of those ecosystems. So there's going to be, I'll say, multiple phases of that 80% that we move through, but we're making a lot of progress.
Well, tell us more about that. I mean, when the first time a partner firm pulls down one of the databases and joins the network, so to speak, like what do they have to change in order to do that about the way they do business today?
Sure, I'll take that one on. So I would first just take a quick step back from that and note that the way that this has been structured very specifically by DTCC is to make it so that nobody who interacts with the trade information warehouse today has to change anything necessarily, right? So it's totally up to the option of the end user. They can hit the same APIs, hit the same interfaces, same login, same credentials, everything, and still consume and interact with this exactly as they do today. If they elect to take something in-house, so if they elect to take in a node, right, which is this piece of software, you install it, it's configured, and then it automatically starts consuming and synchronizing against your trade data, the question for them is then going to be, what are the pieces they need to build around it, as to David's question, right? So that includes, you know, to what extent are there abstraction layers that need to be able to connect, APIs really, that need to be able to connect into systems that they have today. Somebody brought up identity management, right? So every firm is going to have their own credentialing system. How is that going to integrate with the private key management, right? Everything on the blockchain has to be signed by a cryptographic private key, right? So how does their custom identity management system connect with a standardized key management or key signing protocol, and then deliver that out into the rest of the blockchain, right? I mean, these kind of things are going to have to be considered. Similarly, I mean, any sort of internal or downstream systems, I would put in the same category, right? You have your initial point where you capture the trade, but at the end of the day, you also have to touch your risk systems, your settlement systems, any sort of economic or accounting systems. Or, I mean, these things are. These organizations are large and they're not singular, right? They exist as many different groups, each of which may have a node or a piece of blockchain infrastructure that does that automated synchronization, but each one of them is going to require a thoughtful process around the integrations.
So when does the first phase go live? And maybe I should define that as like Pramod, you might be able to take the first crack at this, but like cutting over live trading operations, even on the post-trade side, is no small thing, right? So what's the implementation look like running them side by side versus cutover?
So at this point in time, we're trying to finish our solution development phase in first quarter 2018, right? After that, given that this particular solution has to process $11 trillion, there's expected to be a prolonged parallel period to measure the results that you would see on DLT versus the legacy platform. In terms of when a bank would actually see a node, I can tell you that they would see a node sooner than we had planned. There's a lot of interest from different member banks to see it right away,
yeah.
Right? I think there are discussions in place underway where we're trying to see what is that right time when a bank would take a node and at least starts to play with it.
But Robert, when would you be live
that.
with trades running over it, even if it is in parallel to the existing system?
We're working with the industry on the appropriate user acceptance test model. We expect early 18, and I think that's fair. It's again, it's 11 trillion. The industry would not let us, and we would not proceed, and our regulators would not allow us to proceed if we didn't have the full confidence in the safety of the ecosystem.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we are out of time, but I thought it was a great discussion and wonderful to see a real project that's going to be brought to market next year. So thank you to all the panelists.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.